The autumn of 1922 brought the kind of cold that settled into southeastern Ohio like a creditor, patient, thorough, and unwilling to leave until it had taken what it came for. The hills around Darke County had gone bare early that year, stripped by a wet September, followed by 3 hard frosts before the calendar had any right to them, and the farms that stretched across the county's wide, flat bottomland wore the stripped, exhausted look of places that had given everything they had and were still being asked for more. The town of Greenville sat at the center of it. 7,000 souls pressed together along the Miami River's upper reach, dependent on the grain markets and the small manufacturers that lined the rail spur running north to Dayton. That year, the grain prices had not recovered from the post-war collapse that had begun in 1920 and showed no intention of turning around before more farms went under. The county recorder's office had processed 11 foreclosure actions since January. There were 3 more pending. Annie Oakley was 52 years old that October, and she was thinking about a woman she had never met. She had read the name in the Greenville Gazette 3 days before, buried in the middle column of the news section under a heading that said, in plain type, Property Notice, Darke County Circuit Court. The name was Clara Birdsong. The property was described as 47 acres with improvements, located on the Ansonia Road 4 miles northeast of town, held since 1904 under a mortgage originally drawn with the Greenville Savings and Loan Association. The notice gave a hearing date, October 14, 1922. The outstanding obligation was listed at $840.60. The notice was 11 lines long. It contained nothing else about Clara Birdsong. Annie had set the paper down on the kitchen table of the house she shared with her husband Frank Butler, and she had not immediately gone back to it. She had done other things that morning. She had oiled her Remington. She had written 2 letters, one to a promoter in Cincinnati and one to her sister in Ohio. She had eaten a late breakfast and looked out the back window at the yard, where the October light came in thin and white and did not warm anything it touched. But the name had stayed in her mind, the way a distant shot stays in the ear after the report. Not loud, but present. $840.60 for a farm she had held since 1904. Annie knew the weight of that kind of number. She had grown up in a farmhouse in Darke County, in conditions that did not permit for sentiment about money, and she had known from a very young age what it meant when a family could not pay what it owed. She had watched her own family navigate the margins of poverty after her father died, had watched her mother remarry badly, and watched what happened to a household when the ground shifted beneath it and there was nothing to hold on to. She had hunted to keep the family fed. She had trapped quail and sold them to a hotel in Greenville when she was 8 years old, not because it was charming, but because someone had to. The money had mattered absolutely, and the absence of it had mattered in ways that did not go away, even when the money eventually came. She had spent 3 decades as the headline attraction of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, had toured Europe, had performed before crowned heads, had earned more in a single season than most Darke County farmers saw in a decade. None of that had made her careless about the specific gravity of $840. It had only made her more aware of what it could mean to someone for whom it represented everything. She picked the paper back up and read the notice again. Clara Birdsong, October 14th, 47 acres with improvements. That was 3 days away. Annie Oakley set the paper back down and began to think very carefully about what she intended to do. Clara Jane Birdsong had been born in 1878 in a crossroads community called Piqua, about 30 miles south of Greenville, the second of 4 children belonging to a farmer named George Alderman and his wife Ruth. The Aldermans were not prosperous people, but they were steady, and steady in Miami County in the 1870s meant something specific. You planted what the land could carry. You did not borrow what you could not repay, and you stayed. George Alderman had done all three until a bout of typhoid in 1894 had taken him at 51, leaving Ruth with the 4 children, and a farm that was already mortgaged and could not be managed without him. The older boy, Robert, had been 17 and not interested in staying. He had gone to Columbus within a year of his father's death. The younger two were too small. It had fallen to Clara, who was 16, and already possessed of the kind of practical intelligence that does not announce itself, but simply solves problems, to hold the household together through the year after her father died. She had done it. She had worked the farm alongside her mother through one growing season, learned what she needed to know, and then made the practical decision that the farm could not feed 4 people without help it was not going to get. She had found work in Piqua at a dry goods operation, had worked there for 4 years, had sent money home regularly, and had in that way kept the Alderman household from going under, while her younger siblings finished their schooling. She had not done this with any great drama. She had simply done what was necessary, because she understood that someone had to. She had met Thomas Birdsong in 1900 at a church social in Piqua. Thomas was 24 years old, the son of a Darke County farmer from a settlement called Palestine, about 9 miles from Greenville. He was a quiet, serious young man who had grown up working land and who had a clear idea of what he wanted, which was a farm of his own, a wife who understood what farm life was, and enough years of work ahead of him to build something permanent. Clara had understood farm life since she was 16. They had been married in June of 1901. They spent the next 3 years in Palestine, working for Thomas's father and saving what they could. The saving was slow. Farm wages in Darke County at the turn of the century were not generous, and the expenses of establishing a household were steady and real. But Thomas was methodical, and Clara was careful, and by the spring of 1904 they had saved enough, with a mortgage from the Greenville Savings and Loan to close the gap, to purchase 47 acres on the Ansonia Road, 4 miles northeast of Greenville. The price was $1,200. The down payment was $360, which represented 3 years of accumulated savings. The mortgage was for $840 at 5% annual interest, to be retired over 15 years. They had moved onto the property in April of 1904. The improvements at that time consisted of a wood frame house of 2 rooms, a bank barn in fair condition, and a well that ran clean. There was a kitchen garden already turned over from a previous occupant. There were no fences to speak of. Thomas had spent the first summer fencing and the second planting, and by the 3rd year the farm was producing corn and oats on the bottom acres and carrying 12 head of cattle on the upper pasture. Clara had maintained a kitchen garden that by 1908 was selling surplus vegetables at the Greenville market on Saturday mornings, which added a modest but regular amount to the household income. They had 2 children, a daughter, Rose, born in 1903 before the farm purchase, and a son, Henry, born in 1906. Rose had grown up on the farm and by 1922 was 19 years old, working part-time as a clerk at a dry goods store in Greenville. Henry was 16, still in school, and working the farm alongside his mother in the mornings before classes. Thomas Birdsong had died in March of 1919. He had come home from the war. He had enlisted in 1917 at the age of 41, older than the Army preferred but within its requirements, with a cough that the doctors at the Dayton Veterans Facility had diagnosed as a consequence of gas exposure at the Argonne. He had worked the farm through the spring and summer of 1918 with the cough getting worse, had gotten through the winter, and had died in the 2nd week of March 1919 with the snow still on the ground, and the mortgage 18 years from its original date, now requiring $840 to satisfy, the principal having eroded only slowly, as such things do, and Clara Birdsong, 41 years old with 2 children and 47 acres and a bank barn and a well that ran clean. She had not left. She had not sold. She had not written to Robert in Columbus, who had a family of his own and no particular obligation to help, and she had not applied to anyone for charity, which she would not have done under any circumstances. She had planted the corn and the oats. She had kept the cattle. She had maintained the kitchen garden and the Saturday market. She had hired a neighbor's boy named Earl Combs, who was 13 in 1919 and large for his age, to help with the heavy work, and she had paid him in cash and vegetables, which was the arrangement they both understood to be fair. She had been paying the mortgage $56 a month without interruption through 1919 and into 1920. Then the grain prices had collapsed. The agricultural depression that began in 1920 and persisted through the early years of the decade was not a natural disaster. It was the consequence of specific policy and market conditions. The end of wartime demand, the return of European agriculture to production, and the Federal Reserve's credit tightening in late 1920 that pulled the floor out from under commodity prices. Corn that had sold for $1.40 a bushel in 1919 dropped to 52 cents by the end of 1920. Oats followed. Cattle prices fell along with them. The farm that had been generating enough income for Clara to meet her obligations and keep a small amount in reserve had, within a single year, been reduced to something that generated enough income to keep the household fed, but not much more. She had missed her October 1920 payment. She had made it up by December, pulling money from the small reserve she kept in a tin box behind the kitchen stove. She had missed again in March 1921, and made that up by May. By the summer of 1921, the reserve was gone. By the fall of 1921, she was running the calculation every week, moving small amounts between the household necessities and the mortgage obligation, and coming up short more often than not. She owed 4 months of back payments by January 1922. She owed 6 months by April. She had gone to the Greenville Savings and Loan in May and spoken to a man named Harold Fenwick, who was the assistant manager of the mortgage department, and she had explained her situation clearly and asked whether there was a provision for renegotiating the payment schedule, given the conditions of the agricultural market. Harold Fenwick had been courteous. He had listened. He had told her that the Savings and Loan had a standard procedure for delinquent mortgages that did not include renegotiation, but that he would pass her inquiry to the senior manager, a man named Edward Crowell. She had waited 2 weeks for a reply. When no reply came, she had returned to the bank and asked to speak with Edward Crowell directly. She had been told that Mr. Crowell was not available. She had been told this 3 times across 3 separate visits, each time with the same courtesy and the same result. In August of 1922, she had received a letter from the law office of Harmon and Gates in Greenville, informing her that the Greenville Savings and Loan had retained the firm to initiate foreclosure proceedings on the property at Ansonia Road, Darke County, and that the outstanding amount required to prevent the action from proceeding was $840.60, the full outstanding balance of the original mortgage, payable before October 14, 1922, at which time the matter would be heard before the Darke County Circuit Court. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday in August, and Clara Birdsong had read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and gone out to the barn to do the feeding, because the cattle did not stop requiring feeding because a letter had arrived. She had done the feeding and returned to the house and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the letter again. Rose had come home from the dry goods store at 6 in the evening and found her there. Clara had shown her the letter. They had sat together for a while without speaking. Then Clara had said that she would find a way, and Rose had said that she knew her mother would, and that had been the conversation. The way she tried to find began the following morning and continued for the next 6 weeks. She had gone to the First National Bank of Greenville and asked about a loan against the property. The First National had declined, citing the existing encumbrance. She had written to her brother Robert in Columbus, describing the situation without exaggeration and asking if he could lend her any portion of what was needed. Robert had written back explaining that he had his own mortgage and 3 children in school and could send $50, which he did, and which Clara received with gratitude while understanding that it was $790 short of what she needed. She had sold 2 of the cattle, the oldest ones, at the worst possible time in the worst possible market, for $63. She had asked the man at the Greenville market who bought her vegetables whether he knew of anyone looking to invest in good farmland, and he had said he would ask around, and he had not gotten back to her. By the first week of October, she had $119 in the tin box behind the stove. The hearing was 8 days away. Annie Oakley knew none of this in specific detail when she read the notice in the Greenville Gazette. She knew the name, the date, the acreage, and the amount. That was what the notice contained, and the notice was what the law required, and the law in those years was not particularly interested in context. But Annie had grown up in Darke County. She had been gone for most of 30 years. The Wild West show, the exhibition tours, the winters in Florida, the years of a life lived at considerable distance from the county lines. But she had come back to Greenville in 1917, she and Frank, because it was home, and because it had always been home in the way that only the place you came from can be home. She knew the Ansonia Road. She knew what 47 acres of bottomland meant in this county, and she knew, from the particular specificity of the amount, $840.60, not a round number, a precise number, the kind that comes off an original loan without much having been paid down, what kind of crisis she was reading about. She had not immediately told Frank. This was not because she intended to keep it from him. It was because she wanted to think it through herself first, which was how she had always approached things that required a decision. Frank Butler had been her partner for 40 years. They had met in 1881 when she had shot against him in a Cincinnati competition and beaten him cleanly, and they had been married in 1882 and had not been separated for more than a few weeks at a time in all the years since. Frank was a good man, a generous man, a man who had never once tried to reduce her or contain her, which was rarer than it should have been, and something she did not take lightly. But she thought best alone, and she thought for 3 days before she said anything. On the morning of the 4th day, she came to the kitchen where Frank was reading the paper, and she told him what she was thinking. He had put the paper down and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he had said, "How much?" she told him. He had nodded once, the way he did when he had already arrived at his own conclusion before she finished speaking, and he said he thought she was right. That was the whole conversation. The money was not a problem for Annie Oakley, not at $840. She had earned well and invested carefully. She had not made the mistakes that many performers made, the extravagance, the trust placed in the wrong people, the failure to think past the current season. She had thought past the current season for her entire life, since the first season she could remember, which had been defined by the question of whether the family would have enough to eat. The money was there. $840.60 would not strain anything. What she was not certain of was the approach. She did not know Clara Birdsong. She did not know whether a woman who had managed 6 weeks of independent effort toward this problem would welcome what amounted to a stranger's intervention without warning. Annie understood pride. Understood it not as a fault but as a structural thing, the way a wall can hold a house up, and she knew that what can hold something up can also, if handled incorrectly, bring it down. She spent the 3 days before the hearing thinking not about whether to help, but about how to help without causing a different kind of harm. She considered writing a letter first. She rejected that. Not enough time, and a letter inviting refusal put the decision in the wrong place. She considered speaking to a lawyer and arranging something anonymous. She rejected that too, because anonymous help, however well intended, had a way of making the person helped feel smaller rather than larger. the beneficiary of a charity they could not confront or thank or understand. She wanted Clara Birdsong to know where the help was coming from, and she wanted her to know it in a way that carried no suggestion of condescension. She was not a wealthy benefactor looking down from a comfortable height at someone unfortunate. She was a woman from Darke County who had grown up with nothing and understood what $840 meant, and she intended to be present in person, and she intended to do this at the bank, before the hearing, where it would be a matter of record and not a private arrangement that could be questioned or reversed. She had Frank drive her to the Greenville Savings and Loan on the morning of October 13th, the day before the hearing, arriving at 20 minutes past 9. The morning was cold. There had been frost on the grass since before dawn, the kind that does not entirely leave until mid-afternoon, and the street in front of the bank was dusted with it on the shaded side. Annie wore her good gray coat, the one with the dark buttons, and she carried the money in an envelope in her coat pocket. $841. She had added 40 cents to make the exact figure, and then $1 more, because there would be fees. She told Frank to wait with the automobile. She went in. It was a moderate-sized bank, well kept, with the particular air that banks in that era carried. Quiet, deliberate, slightly cool in temperature even in summer, and considerably cold in autumn. The teller windows were along the left wall. There were 4 of them, 3 occupied. A young man at the first window looked up when Annie came in. A woman at the second window was assisting a customer with a deposit. At the back of the room, behind a low wooden railing with a swinging gate, there were 2 desks. The man at the nearer desk was Harold Fenwick, whose name Annie had gotten from a woman she knew who had her accounts there. The man at the farther desk was Edward Crowell. Annie approached the gate without hesitation. The young man who had been watching from the first teller window, his name was Arthur Pruitt. He was 23 years old and had worked at the Savings and Loan for 14 months, started forward, uncertain of whether to intercept her or simply observe. He observed. People who moved with that kind of certainty were generally entitled to the destination they had in mind. Harold Fenwick looked up from his desk as Annie came through the gate. She said, "I am here regarding the Birdsong mortgage. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. I am here today because I would like to resolve this before the court date." Fenwick blinked. He said, "I'm sorry, ma'am. Are you a representative of Mrs. Birdsong?"
"I am a neighbor,"
Annie said, which was true in the geographic sense, and she offered nothing further on the subject. Fenwick looked at her for a moment. He was 44 years old, a careful man, a man who operated within procedures and felt most comfortable when procedures were followed. He said, "The outstanding obligation as of today is $840.60. That amount would need to be paid in full to halt the foreclosure action." "Yes," Annie said. "I know what the amount is." She took the envelope from her coat pocket and placed it on his desk. Edward Crowell, at the far desk, had looked up. He was 51 years old, a heavy-set man with a careful, neutral expression, the expression of someone who had learned that neutrality was the safest face to show in situations that had not yet resolved themselves. He set down his pen. Annie said to Fenwick, "Count it, please." Fenwick opened the envelope. He counted the bills with the practiced efficiency of a man whose profession required him to count bills often and accurately. He counted once, then counted again. The total was $842. He looked up at Annie. He said, This is $2 over. There will be fees," Annie said, "for the court notice. Apply the excess to whatever the bank has incurred." Fenwick set the bills in a careful stack on the desk. He looked at Crowell. Crowell gave no instruction. He simply watched. Annie said, "I would like a receipt, and I would like the deed to be prepared in Mrs. Birdsong's name, free and clear of the mortgage encumbrance, and I would like that document to be available for her to collect no later than tomorrow morning." The room had gone very quiet. Arthur Pruitt had abandoned any pretense of returning to his window and was standing near the gate. The woman at the second teller window had finished with her customer and had not moved. There were two other customers in the bank, a man in a work coat waiting at the third window, and a woman in a dark dress sitting in one of the chairs near the door, and both of them were still. Fenwick said slowly, "I can issue a receipt today. The deed preparation will require the senior manager's authorization, and would normally take—" "It will take until tomorrow morning," Annie said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was not asking. "The hearing is at 9 o'clock. Mrs. Birdsong should have her document before she needs to be at the courthouse. That gives your staff this afternoon and this evening." Crowell stood up from his desk. He came to the railing and rested one hand on the top of it and looked at Annie Oakley with the expression of a man reassessing what he was looking at. He said, "I don't believe I've had the pleasure." "I am from Darke County," Annie said. "My name is Annie Oakley. I grew up about 4 miles from the Birdsong property, and I would appreciate it if you would see that the deed is ready." Nobody in that room moved. Crowell looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Of course, Miss Oakley, we can have the document prepared." He said it in the smooth, adjusting way of a man who recognizes that the ground has shifted and intends to be on the right side of the shift. He did not say it with warmth. He said it with the professionalism of someone who has just determined that the most favorable available outcome is compliance. That was sufficient. Annie had not come for warmth. Fenwick wrote out the receipt. He wrote it carefully, in the formal language of the institution, and at the bottom he wrote the date and the amount, and the words, "Mortgage satisfied in full," and he signed it, and handed it to Annie. She read it once, folded it in half, and placed it in her coat pocket. She said, "Please contact Mrs. Birdsong today. She will need to know she does not have to appear tomorrow." Fenwick said he would send a letter. Annie said, "Send someone in person." She left through the front door, walked to where Frank was waiting with the automobile, and got in. Frank looked at her. She looked straight ahead for a moment and then said, "It's done." Frank put the automobile in gear. They drove home. What she did not know, as she drove home on that October morning, was that Clara Birdsong had spent that same morning sitting at the kitchen table on Ansonia Road, in the farmhouse that Thomas had built the second bedroom onto in 1907, going through the tin box behind the stove one more time, not because she expected the contents to have changed, but because there was something in the act of counting that felt like doing something, even when the counting came to the same number it had always come to, $119, the same $119 it had been for 10 days. She had told Rose that morning, before Rose left for the dry goods store, that she was going to go to the hearing and speak and try to get an extension. She had said it with a steadiness that Rose had believed because her mother had always been steady. Rose had believed it because she did not have a better option to offer, and because her mother had never, in all of Rose's 19 years, failed to find a way through. Henry had gone to school. Clara had done the breakfast things and then sat with the tin box. The knock at the farmhouse door came at 11:15 in the morning. She opened the door to find a young man she did not know. He was perhaps 25, in a suit that was a size large for him, and he was holding his hat in both hands and looking slightly uncomfortable in the way of someone delivering an unexpected message. He said that he was from the Greenville Savings and Loan, that his name was Perkins, and that he had been asked to bring her a message regarding her account. Clara looked at him without expression and waited. He said that the mortgage on her property had been paid in full as of this morning, and that her deed would be ready for her to collect at the bank at any time, and that she did not need to appear at the hearing tomorrow. Clara stood in the doorway for a long moment. She said, "What did you say?" Perkins repeated it. He had clearly been told to repeat it as many times as necessary, because his expression said that he had expected to repeat it. He said the mortgage had been paid in full, $840.60, and the deed would be ready, and the foreclosure had been withdrawn. Clara said, "By whom?" Perkins hesitated. He said the bank was not in a position to say at this time. She did not understand what had just happened. She asked him 3 more questions. He answered them with small variations of the same information. Paid in full, deed ready, no hearing. She thanked him with a formality that was the only thing available to her in that moment, and he put his hat back on his head and walked back down the road to where he had left the bank's vehicle, and she closed the door and stood in the kitchen, and the tin box was still on the table, and the farmhouse was very quiet. She sat down. She sat there for 20 minutes. Then she stood up and did the noon feeding, because the cattle did not stop requiring feeding because a young man in a large suit had appeared at her door. She went to the bank the following morning, not to the hearing, because there was no hearing, but to the bank, and she collected the deed. It was a single sheet of legal paper, folded once, with the mortgage notation struck through in red ink, and the words, "Satisfaction of Mortgage," printed across the bottom with the signatures of Harold Fenwick and Edward Krall. Her name was there, Clara Jane Birdsong, and the property description was there, 47 acres on Ansonia Road, and the date was there. She read it 3 times standing at Fenwick's desk. He watched her with the careful expression of a man observing something that he was not sure he had the vocabulary for. She asked who had paid it. Fenwick said, after a pause that was 1 beat longer than necessary, that the payment had been made by a private individual who had requested that the bank not disclose the identity. Clara folded the deed and put it in her bag and thanked him and walked out. She knew it within 2 days. Greenville in 1922 was a town of 7,000 people, and Arthur Pruitt had mentioned it to his mother that evening. And his mother had mentioned it to her neighbor, Mrs. Dunlap, and Mrs. Dunlap had mentioned it at the ladies' auxiliary meeting on Thursday evening, where 3 people who knew Clara either directly or through the Saturday market connection heard it and understood why it mattered. Clara received the information on the Friday morning from the woman who bought her vegetables, a woman named May Hollis, who had been buying Clara's surplus squash and carrots every Saturday for 4 years, and who had the directness that comes from long acquaintance. May said she had heard it was Annie Oakley. May said it in the same tone she used to report market prices, factual, without embellishment. Clara went home and thought about this for a long time. She thought about it for 3 months. What she felt was not straightforwardly gratitude, or rather, it was gratitude underneath something more complicated. Something that had to do with the fact that she had spent 6 weeks working toward that $840 and had failed, and the failure sat in her alongside the rescue in a way she could not quite resolve. She was grateful. She was profoundly grateful. She was also a woman who had managed her own affairs for 18 years since Thomas had died, who had kept the farm without asking anyone for the kind of help that amounted to the permanent removal of an obligation. And the deed in her bag, which solved everything, also meant that she had not solved it herself. She was not ungrateful. She was not resentful. She was just honest, and she was honest enough to recognize that the thing she felt was not simple, and she wanted to speak to Annie Oakley about it in person, face to face, before she could simply accept it and move forward. She found out where Annie and Frank Butler lived from May Hollis, who knew where everyone in Greenville lived. She wrote a letter in November and received no reply. She wrote a second letter in December, more specific, asking if she could come to call at a time convenient to Miss Oakley. She received no reply to that one either. She learned in January from May Hollis that Annie and Frank had been in Florida for the winter. They went most years now, the Florida climate being better for Annie's health, which had not been entirely steady since the automobile accident in 1922. The letters had presumably sat unopened. She thought she would let it go. She thought she would simply hold the gratitude without being able to express it, and that this was the condition of having been helped by someone who did not want anything in return, not even thanks. She thought this for about 3 weeks, and then she thought it again, and the second time she thought it, she decided she was not going to let it go, not because she could not, but because it seemed wrong to let something that large pass without acknowledgement, not for her own sake, to clear her own conscience about the complexity of what she felt, but because the woman who had done it was real, had been present, had stood at a bank desk on a cold October morning, and counted out $842 on a stranger's behalf, and that act deserved to be seen. In January of 1923, she found out that Annie and Frank were expected back from Florida by the end of February. She resolved to call on them in March. In February of 1923, Annie Oakley was in a hotel in Leesburg, Florida, with a persistent fever that the doctor described as influenza, and that she privately suspected was something more systemic, the kind of slow diminishment that comes not from a single illness, but from a body that has been performing at full capacity for half a century and is beginning to say, quietly, that it would prefer not to continue at the same pace. She was 53 years old. She was not dying. She would live another 3 years, and they would be active years, still traveling, still performing occasional exhibitions, still shooting. But she was tired in a way she had not been tired before, a bone-deep tiredness that rest helped but did not cure. She had not thought about Clara Birdsong since October. This was not indifference. It was simply that the thing had been done, and her tendency, formed over decades of a life in which most of what she did was done on a stage or a parade ground in front of thousands of people, was to finish a thing and move on without looking back. The looking back was for other people. She had always found more use in looking forward. She did not know, lying in the hotel room in Leesburg with the Florida winter coming through the window as a thin, warm gray, that there was a woman in Darke County who had spent 3 months trying to find her. She would not know until March. Frank Butler drove her home to Greenville at the end of February. The automobile journey from Leesburg through Georgia and Tennessee and into Ohio, 3 days on roads that varied between adequate and difficult, and they arrived at the house on the 4th of March, 1923. The mail that had accumulated over the winter included 2 letters from the same address, written in a neat, confident hand, signed Clara J. Birdsong, Ansonia Road, Darke County. Annie read them the morning of the 5th. She read the first one, then the second. Then she sat with both of them in her lap for a few minutes. Frank looked over from his chair and said, "The Birdsong farm? She wants to come call," Annie said. "Are you surprised?" Annie thought about it. She said, no. She had known, abstractly, that the woman would try to respond. She had simply arranged things so that the response would be delayed long enough for it to matter less. The bank's instructions to maintain her anonymity, the winter away, the time that passing weeks provide for the acute edge of obligation to soften into something more manageable. She had not anticipated 3 months of sustained effort to reach her. That was more persistence than she had accounted for. She wrote back the same morning. She wrote that she would be glad to receive Mrs. Birdsong at any time she found convenient, and that she hoped the farm was well, and that she was sorry the letters had sat unanswered through the winter. She did not mention the money. There was nothing to say about the money that the money itself had not already said. Clara Birdsong came on the 12th of March, a Wednesday, a bright cold day with the last of the winter ice retreating from the north-facing slopes. She drove herself in the farm truck, the old one that Thomas had bought in 1916, and that still ran if you were patient with it in cold weather. She was 45 years old, a lean, upright woman, with dark hair gone partly gray, and a face that had the particular weathered quality of someone who has worked outdoors through 40 Ohio winters. She wore her good coat. She had brought a jar of apple butter, the kind she made from the small orchard on the northwest corner of the property. which she had been making every autumn since 1905. Frank let her in. He was warm with her the way Frank was warm with everyone, and he brought her into the sitting room and called to Annie, and then went to the kitchen to put the kettle on, which was his way of creating the space that was needed. Annie came into the sitting room, and they looked at each other for a moment. Clara said, "I have been trying to find you for 3 months." Annie said, "I know. I'm sorry I was not here." Clara sat down. She placed the jar of apple butter on the table beside her, with the careful deliberateness of someone fulfilling an intention, rather than making a casual gesture. She said, "I want to thank you properly. I know you didn't want—" She paused. "I know you arranged things so that I might not be able to, but I needed to say it in person." Annie said, "You don't owe me anything." Clara said, "I know I don't, but I needed to say it. It isn't about owing." She was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about how to say this for 3 months, and I still don't have quite the right words. What I want you to know is that I understand what you did. Not just the money. I mean, I understand the thought behind it. The way it was done. You came in person and you made it a matter of record, and you made it so that I wouldn't have to negotiate or explain or be grateful in public. I have thought about that a great deal." Annie was quiet. Clara said, "I grew up the same way you did. Not the same county, Piqua, but the same kind of family. I know what it means to manage what you have. I know what it means to not be able to ask for help when you need it. And I know that the way you helped, quietly, and as a fact, and not as a charity, was something that took thought." Annie looked at her for a moment. She said, "I knew what you would have spent the previous 6 weeks doing. I didn't want the way I did it to undo any of that." Clara nodded slowly. She said, "It didn't. I want you to know that." She looked at the jar of apple butter on the table. "This is inadequate." "Apple butter from a working orchard is not inadequate," Annie said. Clara looked up at her. Something in her face changed. Not relief exactly, but the adjustment that happens when a weight that has been carried for some time is finally set down in the right place. She said, "The farm is going to be all right. The prices are still bad, but I have the cattle, and Henry is 16 now, and Rose is sending money home most months. I have the deed." She said those last 3 words in a particular way, the way someone says something that they have needed to say aloud to make it real. "I have the deed." Annie said, "Yes, you do." They drank tea. Frank came back and sat with them for a while, and the conversation moved to other things. The farm, the condition of the Ansonia Road after the winter, the state of the Saturday market, the particulars of the apple variety that produced the best butter. They talked for nearly an hour. When Clara rose to leave, she shook Annie's hand, and then she did something that she had not planned to do. She said, "I want to ask you something." Annie waited. Clara said, "Did you know my husband, Thomas Birdsong? He went to the Argonne with the 37th Division." Annie said that she did not, but that she was sorry for the loss. Clara said, "He was a good farmer and a good man. He would have been very embarrassed about the mortgage. I want you to know that." She left without waiting for an answer, the way someone leaves when they have said exactly what they meant and do not need a response to complete it. Frank and Annie stood in the doorway and watched the old farm truck start up after 2 attempts and move down the road toward the Ansonia Road and the 47 acres that were now, without encumbrance, Clara Birdsong's own. Annie did not speak for a moment. Then she went inside, and Frank closed the door against the March cold, and the day continued. 6 months after that March visit, in September of 1923, when the second corn crop on the Ansonia Road property was coming in, and the weather had finally cooperated after 2 lean years, Clara Birdsong cleared $411 from the season. She had expanded the kitchen garden to half an acre after Henry took on a larger share of the cattle management, and the Saturday market had grown to include a regular customer in a restaurant on Broadway Street in Greenville whose cook had discovered that Clara's root vegetables were more consistent than the wholesale supplier. The restaurant order was $12 a week, $48 a month, which was not enormous but was steady in the way that steady matters when you are building back from nothing. Henry Birdsong was 17 that year, taller than his father had been. With his father's deliberateness and his mother's efficiency, he had taken to the cattle management with the seriousness of someone who understood that the cattle were not a hobby but a foundation, and the herd had grown to 15 head by the following spring. Earl Combs, who had been the neighbor's boy hired for heavy work in 1919, was now 19 and working for Clara 3 days a week, at a cash wage that was modest but dependable. And Earl was the kind of young man who showed up when he said he would, and did not need to be told the same thing twice. By October of 1924, 2 years after the deed had been recorded and the mortgage notation struck through in red ink, the farm on Ansonia Road was operating in the black for the first time since 1919. The margin was not wide. 47 acres in Darke County in the mid-1920s did not generate wide margins, but it was positive, and it was Clara's, and she knew to the dollar what the situation was, because she had always known to the dollar what the situation was. She kept the deed in a wooden box on the shelf in the front room, not behind the stove in the tin box where the money had lived, but in the front room where it could be seen, in the wooden box that Thomas had made the first winter from wood salvaged from the old fence posts he had pulled up to reset. She opened the box sometimes and looked at the deed with its red ink notation, and the date in October 1922, and the signatures at the bottom. She had not lost the habit of looking at it. She had written one more letter to Annie Oakley in the spring of 1924, reporting on the state of the farm without asking for anything, the corn yield, the cattle count, the restaurant order, because she thought the woman who had made the investment deserved to know that the investment had not been wasted. Annie had written back a short note in which she said she was glad to hear it, and that the apple butter had been very good. That was the last correspondence between them. The town of Greenville had not missed the October 1922 event, though it had processed it differently in different places. Arthur Pruitt, the young teller at the Greenville Savings and Loan who had watched from his window as Annie Oakley came through the gate and placed the envelope on Fenwick's desk, had thought about it regularly in the months that followed. He was 23 years old, working in a bank, in a year when the bank was processing foreclosure on 11 farms in the county, and the arithmetic of what he had witnessed had lodged in him in a way that changed how he saw the transactions he processed every day. He was not a sentimental man. Banking did not recruit for sentiment, but he was a just man, or wanted to be, and he had spent a year after October 1922 thinking about the difference between what the institution required and what the situation required, and whether there was any room between those two things. In 1925, he was promoted to assistant manager, occupying the desk that had been Harold Fenwick's. In the early 1930s, when the Depression came to Darke County with the particular violence it reserved for agricultural communities, Pruitt had restructured 14 mortgages rather than foreclose on them, working within the institution's rules but at the edge of them, finding the room that the rules technically permitted and using it. He never mentioned Annie Oakley in connection with this practice. But May Hollis, who still ran the Saturday market and who knew more about the town's history than any single person had a right to, said in 1938 to a woman who had asked why the Savings and Loan had been more lenient than the banks in neighboring counties, "There was a thing that happened here in 1922. It changed how some people thought about what you could do." She did not elaborate. She was not the elaborating kind. Rose Birdsong, who had been 19 years old in October of 1922 and working at the dry goods store, married a man named Douglas Hartwell in 1926. Douglas was a carpenter who did good work and charged fair prices, and they built a house on the south end of the Ansonia Road property. on 2 acres that Clara signed over to them as a wedding gift. The first time land from that property had changed hands since Thomas had bought it in 1904. The farmhouse where Clara lived had a second generation nearby for the first time since Thomas died. Henry Birdsong had taken the full farm management in hand by 1928, when Clara was 50, and she had shifted gradually into the background of the operation while remaining in the farmhouse, which was hers, and which she intended to leave to Henry in time. Annie Oakley died on November 3, 1926, in Greenville, Ohio. She was 66 years old. The immediate cause was pernicious anemia, the illness that had been quietly diminishing her since the early 1920s. Frank Butler, who had been with her for 45 years, survived her by 18 days. They were buried in the Brock Cemetery in Greenville, not far from where Annie had grown up, not far from the farmhouse where her mother had raised her on the margins of poverty, not far from the county she had left and returned to across the span of her life. The Greenville Gazette published an obituary that ran a full column on the inside page. It covered her career with the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, her exhibitions before Queen Victoria, her famous match against Frank Butler in 1881, her record-setting performances. It mentioned her birth as Phoebe Ann Mosey, and it mentioned her years in Darke County at the beginning and the end of her life. It did not mention October 1922 or the Birdsong mortgage. Such things did not appear in obituaries. Clara Birdsong read the obituary on the morning of November 5, 1926, sitting at the kitchen table where she had sat with the tin box 4 years before. She read it twice. Then she set the paper down and went to the front room and opened the wooden box that Thomas had made from the salvaged fence posts, and she took out the deed, the one with the red ink notation and the October 1922 date, and she held it for a while. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not think Annie Oakley would have wanted that as a response. She thought about what the deed represented, not just the farm, not just the 47 acres, but the specific decision that had been made by a specific woman on a specific cold October morning to walk into a bank and place an envelope on a desk for a stranger she had never met. The decision that had been made not in the heat of the moment but after 3 days of careful thought, in the particular way that someone makes a decision when they have thought it all the way through and they know it is right and they intend to act on it. She put the deed back in the wooden box and closed it and went out to check on the cattle, because the cattle did not stop requiring attention because a woman in Greenville had died. By 1935, the farm on Ansonia Road was running 22 head of cattle and 60 acres of mixed grain. Henry had bought an adjacent 13 acres from a neighbor who was selling in the depths of the Depression, and the Birdsong name on the property was not going anywhere. Henry had married a woman named Louise Gentry in 1931, and they had a daughter in 1933 named Anne, a name that Clara had suggested and Henry had agreed to without much discussion, which was how the two of them generally operated. Clara told Henry why she had suggested the name. Henry said he had already figured it out. By 1950, when Clara Birdsong died in the farmhouse on Ansonia Road at the age of 72, the property had been in continuous birdsong operation for 46 years. The wooden box with the deed was on the shelf in the front room where it had always been, and the deed was in it. And when Henry went through his mother's things in the weeks after her death, he opened the box and saw it, the single folded sheet, the red ink notation, the October 1922 date, the name at the bottom that was not a Birdsong name. He kept the box. He put it back on the shelf. Anne Birdsong, Henry's daughter, named in 1933 in the farmhouse kitchen with no ceremony and no announcement, just a decision made by a grandmother and a father sitting at a table, grew up on the Ansonia Road property, learned the farm from her father the way Henry had learned it from his mother, and took it over in 1972 when Henry died at 66, the same age Annie Oakley had been in 1926. She was 39 years old in 1972. a practical, direct woman who ran the farm with her husband, a man named Carter Webb, and with a thoroughness that would have been recognizable to both Henry and Clara. She had grown up with the story, not as legend, not as something embellished or sentimentalized, but as fact. The year, the amount, the woman, the deed. Her grandmother had told it to her twice, both times in a plain voice, without drama. The first time Anne was 7 years old and did not fully understand it. The second time she was 12 and she did. She understood it as a story about what a person who has resources can choose to do with them, and about the specific thought required to do that thing in a way that adds to someone's dignity rather than subtracting from it. She did not think of it as a story about charity. She thought of it as a story about precision. The same quality, she understood later, that had made Annie Oakley the best shot of her era. The shot that matters is the one placed exactly right, not approximately right. The help that matters is the one given in exactly the right way, not approximately the right way. The wooden box with the deed was on the shelf in the front room in 1972, and it was on the shelf in 1991, and it was on the shelf in the spring of 2003 when Anne Webb, née Birdsong, granddaughter of Clara, named in a farmhouse kitchen in 1933 for a woman she would never meet, sat down at the Darke County Historical Society's annual meeting and told the story to a room of 40 people who had gathered to hear about the agricultural history of the county. She told it plainly, the way her grandmother had told it to her. She said, "There was a mortgage, and there was a woman who paid it, and the woman's name was Annie Oakley, and she was from this county, 4 miles from this farm, and she thought about how to do it before she did it, and she did it right. She had brought the deed. She passed it around the room in its wooden box, the box that Thomas Birdsong had built from salvaged fence posts in the winter of 1904, the winter before the farm purchase, the winter of planning for a future that had lasted through the century and past it. The people in the room passed the box carefully. They looked at the deed with its red ink notation, satisfaction of mortgage, October 13th, 1922. And they looked at the signatures at the bottom, Harold Fenwick and Edward Crowell, the names of men doing their institutional duty on a morning when someone else was doing something different. They looked at the date. They looked at the amount, $840.60. The amount was not in question. It had never been in question. The question, the only question that had ever mattered, that still mattered in a room in Greenville, Ohio in 2003, with the October light coming through the Historical Society's windows at the same angle it had come through every window in Darke County for as long as there had been windows, was not whether the money had been paid. The question was whether she had meant it. She had meant it.